Somewhere in your pocket or your purse right now, there might be a crumpled dollar bill you haven't thought about twice. You hand it over for coffee, you get your change, you move on with your morning. It feels permanent, inevitable even. And yet for the first 86 years of American independence, that bill simply did not exist. No federal government had ever printed it. Not one. And for the century and a half before that, before the United States was even an idea, the situation was stranger still. So how did people actually pay for anything? How did a farmer in Virginia settle a debt? How did a merchant in Boston close a sale? How did a civilization that would one day become the richest economy on earth manage to function without the one tool we now consider basic to daily life? The answer runs through tobacco leaves, strings of clamshells, foreign silver, rampant counterfeiting, and one of the most catastrophic currency collapses ever recorded. That collapse cut so deep that the men who wrote the American Constitution built it, in part, to make sure it could never happen again. This is a story about money. But underneath that, it's a story about trust, about who gets to hold power, and about what it actually takes to build an economy out of nothing at all. We have to start well before 1776. Back in the early 1600s, when the first English colonists stepped off their ships onto the eastern edge of a continent they barely understood, they found no banks, no mints, no financial system of any kind waiting for them. Back home, England ran on coin, silver pennies, shillings, pounds. But the English crown had zero interest in shipping its precious metal across an ocean to prop up a handful of struggling settlements. Worse, it actively forbade the colonies from minting coins of their own. That wasn't carelessness. It was calculated. Control over currency was tied directly to sovereignty, and England had no intention of handing its colonies anything that smelled like independence. So the settlers were left stranded, with goods to trade and land to work but nothing reliable to trade or work with. Whatever coin did cross the Atlantic tended to flow right back to pay for imported goods. Benjamin Franklin himself noted that gold and silver entering the colonies was almost immediately drained back to Britain, leaving local tradesmen permanently short of hard cash. So people improvised. The first fallback was the oldest system humans have ever used: barter. Got a cow, need grain? Find someone with grain who wants a cow. Simple enough on paper, miserable in practice. Picture yourself as a blacksmith in Massachusetts in 1640. You need flour. The miller has no use for horseshoes. Now you're hunting for a third party who wants horseshoes and happens to have something the miller actually needs, just to make one transaction work. It was slow, clumsy, and a genuine drag on economic life. But barter wasn't the only workaround. Colonists soon realized certain everyday commodities, things nearly everyone needed and valued fairly consistently, could double as informal money. The most famous of these was tobacco. In Virginia, tobacco wasn't simply a cash crop, it functioned as actual currency. As early as 1619, just 12 years after Jamestown was founded, Virginia officially made tobacco legal tender. You could pay your taxes with it. You could settle a debt with it. You could even buy a wife with it, and that's not a figure of speech. When the Virginia Company shipped young women over as prospective brides for settlers, the price was set at 120 pounds of tobacco per woman. Tobacco had real strengths as currency. Everyone grew it, everyone wanted it, and you could divide it into whatever quantity a transaction required. But it had serious flaws too. It spoiled. It was heavy and awkward to move. Its value swung wildly with each harvest, and a bumper crop could crush the value of everyone's savings almost overnight. Eventually, Virginia began issuing tobacco warehouse receipts, paper slips representing a fixed quantity of leaf sitting in storage. It solved the hauling problem, and it also marked one of America's earliest experiments in letting paper stand in for something of real physical value. It would not be the last. Further north, a completely different commodity currency took hold, one the European settlers borrowed straight from the people who were already there: wampum. It's worth pausing here because wampum has been badly flattened by popular history into a simple label: Indian money. That framing erases what it actually meant. For the Munsee, the Haudenosaunee, and other eastern woodland nations, wampum, small cylindrical beads carved from whelk and quahog shells, carried far more weight than commerce. It was used in diplomacy, woven into treaties, and central to spiritual and ceremonial life. Buying and selling was almost beside the point. But Dutch traders arriving in the early 1620s noticed how deeply wampum mattered to native life, and they saw an opening. If native peoples valued it and colonists could produce or acquire it in bulk, wampum could become a bridge currency between two very different economic worlds. And for a while it was. From 1643 to 1660, wampum was formally recognized as legal tender in the Massachusetts colony, with white beads worth less than the rarer purple ones, and exchange rates set by colonial officials. But like tobacco, wampum carried the seeds of its own collapse. European metal tools made it far easier to manufacture than traditional methods ever allowed, which meant the supply could balloon almost overnight. British authorities disapproved, and the practice was officially shut down by 1660, though wampum kept quietly circulating at frontier trading posts for decades afterward. While farmers were counting out tobacco leaves and traders were stringing shells, a far more conventional form of money was moving through the colonies: foreign coin and above all, the Spanish dollar. Known as the Spanish milled dollar, or the piece of 8, or the real da ocho, this coin was among the most trusted currencies on the planet during the 1600s and 1700s. Struck from silver pulled out of mines in Mexico and South America, it was consistent in weight, dependable in purity, and recognized from Canton to Cadiz. Because Spain's empire touched nearly every corner of the globe, its silver dollar became the closest thing the world had to a universal currency. In a colonial economy starved of reliable English coin, it became the de facto standard. Merchants from Charleston to Philadelphia to New York relied on Spanish dollars for their biggest transactions. And here's a detail most people never learn. To make change, colonists would physically cut the coin apart. A Spanish dollar was worth 8 reals, so it could be sliced into halves, quarters, or eighths. Those eighth pieces were called bits, which is exactly where the phrase 2 bits for a quarter comes from. The Spanish dollar was so woven into American commerce that when the newly independent United States finally built its own monetary system, it modeled the dollar directly on it. The Coinage Act of 1792 explicitly pegged the new US dollar to the value of the Spanish milled dollar, and remarkably, the Spanish coin remained legal tender in the United States all the way until 1857, nearly 70 years after the Constitution took effect. But commodity money and foreign coin could only carry a growing colonial economy so far. And in 1690, Massachusetts Bay did something no government in the Western world had done before. It printed paper money. Here's the backstory. Massachusetts had just launched a failed military expedition against the French in Canada, part of King William's War, and the soldiers coming home expected pay. The treasury was empty. No gold, no silver, and no realistic way to raise funds through taxation fast enough to satisfy a returning army. So the colony printed paper bills of credit, essentially IOUs backed by a promise that the government would accept them for future tax payments. By 1692 these bills were declared legal tender, and at first they actually worked. Other colonies took note, and one by one, nearly every British colony in North America issued paper currency of its own over the following decades. By the time of the Revolution, 14 different colonies had printed paper money at some point. The catch was that every colony ran its own system, its own denominations, its own exchange rates, its own level of reliability. A Massachusetts pound was not a Pennsylvania pound, which was not a Virginia pound. A note happily accepted on one side of a border might be refused, or heavily discounted on the other. For merchants trading across colonial lines, it was a logistical nightmare. And some colonies simply printed more than they could ever redeem, which crushed the value of their currency and wiped out the savings of anyone holding it. Parliament watched this chaos with growing alarm and responded with the Currency Act of 1751, restricting New England colonies from issuing new bills of credit. A stricter version followed in 1764, extending those limits to every colony. Colonists were furious. To them, this looked like the Crown deliberately strangling their economic freedom, and although the Currency Acts rarely get the same historical attention as the Stamp Act or the tax on tea, they were a genuine grievance that helped push the colonies toward revolution. Then came the war itself. When the Continental Congress convened in 1775 to organize resistance, it ran headfirst into an overwhelming problem. War is extraordinarily expensive, and Congress had no power to tax. That, after all, was more or less the entire point of the rebellion. Borrowing wasn't much of an option either, since lending money to a scrappy colonial uprising against the world's most powerful empire wasn't exactly a safe bet. France would eventually step in with loans, but in the early years, credit was almost non-existent, and decades of gold and silver draining toward Britain had left the colonies desperately short of hard coin. So Congress reached for the only lever it had left. It printed money. In June of 1775, Congress authorized $2 million in a new paper currency, the Continental dollar, denominated in Spanish milled dollars as a deliberate signal that it was meant to hold real value. Each note promised eventual redemption in gold or silver, funded by future state tax revenue. It was a reasonable plan in theory. In execution, it was a disaster. States were supposed to collect taxes and gradually retire the Continental dollars from circulation. Most didn't. Some dragged their feet, others printed their own competing currencies on top of it, and Congress, desperate to keep its army fed, just kept running the press. By 1779, roughly $241 million in Continental currency had flooded the economy, an almost incomprehensible sum for a colonial economy that size. The result was predictable. Prices exploded. A pair of shoes that once cost a few dollars now cost hundreds. A wagon load of Continental bills could barely buy a wagon load of supplies for Washington's army. One Philadelphia barber reportedly papered the walls of his shop with the worthless bills. In another town, someone tarred a dog, plastered it with Continental notes, and paraded it through the streets as a joke. The phrase, "not worth a Continental," entered American speech as shorthand for total worthlessness, and it stuck for generations. By 1781, a Continental dollar traded at roughly 1,000 to 1 against silver, and Congress was forced to officially concede the collapse, letting old debts settle at 40 Continental dollars for every $1 in hard coin. In every practical sense, it was a government default, and ordinary Americans, soldiers, farmers, shopkeepers, the very people who had fought and sacrificed for independence, were left holding what amounted to expensive wallpaper. That experience left a scar on the American psyche that never fully healed. When delegates gathered in Philadelphia in 1787 to draft the Constitution, the memory of the Continental collapse was still raw. They had watched their own government's currency become a national humiliation. They had seen inflation gut savings, shred public trust, and nearly sink the war effort, and they were determined it would never happen again. So Article 1, Section 10 of the Constitution flatly bars states from coining money, issuing bills of credit, or making anything but gold and silver legal tender for debts. The federal government alone was given the power to coin money and set its value. But notably, the Constitution says nothing at all about the federal government printing paper currency. That silence was intentional. The framers wanted an economy anchored in hard money, the intrinsic worth of gold and silver, not in the fragile promises of politicians. In 1792, Congress passed the Coinage Act, one of the most consequential economic laws in American history. It established the U.S. Mint in Philadelphia and created a decimal-based monetary system, an idea championed by Thomas Jefferson. The dollar was pegged directly to the Spanish milled dollar and backed by a bimetallic standard of gold and silver, with denominations ranging from the $10 gold eagle down to copper half-cents. Alexander Hamilton shaped much of this legislation, envisioning a system that would give the young republic credibility abroad, where every coin carried a specific verifiable amount of precious metal built directly into the object itself. The founders took the integrity of that system so seriously that any mint officer caught debasing the nation's coinage could face the death penalty. But hard money came with a hard problem. There simply wasn't enough of it. The United States was expanding fast, its population and economy growing far quicker than its coin supply could keep up with. Farmers needed credit for land and seed, merchants needed capital for trade, manufacturers needed money to build. In its very first full year, the new mint produced just over 11,000 copper cents, a trickle compared to what the economy required. Gold and silver coins were even harder to keep circulating, because the exchange ratio Congress set between the two metals, 15 to 1, didn't match international markets, so people simply melted American coins down or shipped them overseas for a better price. The same thing happened with silver dollars, which frequently drained toward the Caribbean for use in foreign trade. Congress eventually had to suspend minting silver dollars and gold eagles altogether for a stretch, just to slow the bleeding. Spanish dollars, French francs, and British coin kept circulating alongside the new national currency for decades, because there simply wasn't a domestic alternative. Into that gap rushed private banks. Starting in the early 1800s, state-chartered banks began printing their own paper notes, not government money, but private promises stating the bearer could redeem the note for gold or silver at that specific bank. In theory, it expanded the money supply beyond what physical coin allowed. In practice, it was bedlam. By 1810, there were more than 90 state-chartered banks issuing notes. By 1820, over 300. By the 1830s, hundreds more on top of that. Every bank's notes looked different, came in different denominations, and traded at wildly different values depending on how solvent the issuing bank was and how far you were standing from its front door. A note from a well-capitalized Philadelphia bank might trade at full value in the city and get discounted 20% a few counties over. A note from a shaky Ohio bank might fetch 50 cents on the dollar in New York, or nothing at all if the bank had already failed. Merchants couldn't just glance at a bill and know its worth. They had to judge the creditworthiness of whatever institution had printed it. That need gave rise to an entire genre of publication. The Banknote Reporter, pocket-sized guides listing thousands of different notes from banks across the country, their current discount rates, and warnings about known counterfeits. Shopkeepers kept them on the counter and flipped through them constantly. At the system's peak, more than 8,000 distinct varieties of banknotes were circulating in the United States, more distinct paper currencies than exist anywhere in the world today. And with that much variety in circulation, counterfeiting flourished. By some estimates, roughly a third of all paper money changing hands during this period was fake, meaning one bill in every three you handled might be worthless, with no reliable way to tell. This stretch of chaos, roughly 1837 to 1863, is remembered as the free banking era, and it kicked off when President Andrew Jackson killed the Second Bank of the United States. To understand why, you have to understand Jackson himself. He was a frontiersman and war hero with a deep, almost personal hatred of banks and paper money, forged early in his life when he accepted paper notes for a land sale, only to watch the buyers go bankrupt and the notes turn worthless, a loss that nearly ruined him. He never forgot it, and he spent the rest of his career convinced that only gold and silver, hard specie you could hold in your hand, counted as real money. The Second Bank, chartered in 1816 with a 20-year charter and headquartered in Philadelphia, was meant to bring order to the mess. It was a hybrid institution, 20% federally owned, that acted as the government's fiscal agent and functioned as something close to a central bank, tightening or loosening credit by controlling how much state bank paper it presented for redemption in hard coin. Under Nicholas Biddle, who took over as president in 1823, it worked reasonably well. The economy stabilized, inflation stayed in check, and currency became more uniform than it had ever been. But Jackson saw it as a monster, a concentration of power in the hands of a wealthy northeastern elite while ordinary farmers and workers in the South and West were left at their mercy, and he wasn't entirely wrong about that imbalance. When he vetoed the bank's Recharter in 1832, he framed it as a fight for ordinary Americans against a corrupt financial aristocracy, and the veto held. The bank's charter expired in 1836, and the United States would not have another central banking institution until the Federal Reserve was created in 1913, nearly 80 years later. What followed was exactly the chaos the bank's defenders had predicted. With no central authority regulating the money supply, states rushed to fill the void, passing free banking laws that let almost anyone with a little capital and some deposited bonds open a bank and start printing notes. This was the age of the Wildcat Bank, a name supposedly born from banks deliberately setting up in locations so remote that the only visitors were literal wildcats, making it as hard as possible for note holders to show up and demand redemption in gold. Some of these banks operated honestly. Many were outright scams. There are accounts, some likely embellished but rooted in real events, of bank examiners arriving to inspect gold reserves only to find kegs stuffed with nails and scrap iron topped with a thin layer of coin, or the same barrel of gold being rushed from one bank to the next, always one step ahead of the inspector. Notes were issued not just by banks but by states, cities, railroads, stores, churches, and private individuals, with no uniform standard and no safety net. When a bank collapsed, and plenty did, especially during the brutal panics of 1837 and 1857, everyone holding its notes simply lost their money overnight. Picture running a business where every bill handed to you might be counterfeit, might come from a bank that no longer exists, or might lose a fifth of its value by the time you spend it in the next town. That wasn't a rare misfortune. It was the ordinary condition of American commerce for nearly 3 decades. And it was into this fractured system that the most dramatic monetary transformation in American history arrived, not because anyone wanted it, but because the survival of the nation demanded it. In 1861, the country plunged into the Civil War, and the war wasn't just a military crisis, it was a fiscal earthquake. The federal government suddenly needed to fund armies, buy staggering quantities of weapons and supplies, and sustain an effort that would ultimately cost more than the entire federal budget of the previous 50 years combined. Gold coin and scattered private banknotes were nowhere near enough. In July of 1861, Congress authorized the Treasury to print $250 million in demand notes, paper that could, in theory, be redeemed for gold or silver on demand, meant as a stopgap while the government sold bonds to raise real revenue. But when people actually tried to cash them in, the Treasury couldn't keep pace, and by December of 1861 gold reserves had fallen so low that the government was forced to suspend redemption of its own notes. Something more drastic was needed. On February 25, 1862, Congress passed the Legal Tender Act, one of the most consequential laws in American economic history. For the first time, the federal government issued paper currency declared legal tender for all debts, public and private, backed not by gold or silver but purely by the full faith and credit of the United States government. Each note simply stated that it was legal tender for all debts, public and private. No promise of gold. No vault of silver standing behind it. Just a declaration from the government itself that this paper was money and that anyone owed a debt was legally obligated to accept it. Printed with green ink on the back, the notes earned the nickname that has stuck ever since, greenbacks. The initial authorization was $150 million, but the war's appetite kept growing, and two more legal tender acts followed in July of 1862 and March of 1863, each adding another $150 million. By the war's end, nearly $450 million in greenbacks were circulating through the economy. Not everyone accepted them willingly. California and Oregon, flush with gold and deeply suspicious of paper, largely ignored the law and kept doing business in gold coin. Plenty of Americans looked at the greenback with the same wariness their grandparents had shown the Continental dollar. Was this just another government printing press spinning out of control? Would it collapse the same way? Those fears weren't baseless. As the supply of greenbacks expanded, their value against gold slipped, and by mid-1864, a greenback dollar was worth only about 35 cents in gold. Prices climbed, inflation bit hard, and soldiers at the front were being paid in currency worth a fraction of what it had been when they enlisted. But unlike the Continental dollar, the greenback survived. This time, the federal government had real revenue streams behind it, the power to levy income taxes and tariffs in a way the old Continental Congress never had, giving the currency actual institutional backing. The National Banking Acts of 1863 and 1864 created a system of nationally chartered banks issuing uniform notes backed by government bonds, and a 10% tax on state bank notes imposed in 1866 finished pushing the old chaotic patchwork of private currency out of existence. For the first time in the nation's history, America had something close to a single unified currency. That didn't end the argument over what money should even be. For decades afterward, fierce political battles raged over whether to return to a strict gold standard, how fast to retire the greenbacks, and whether the money supply should expand to relieve debt-burdened farmers or stay tight to protect creditors. The Greenback Party emerged in the 1870s pushing to expand the paper supply, but the advocates of gold ultimately won out, and the United States formally adopted the gold standard in 1900. Even so, the fundamental shift that happened in 1862 never reversed. The idea that money didn't need to be a lump of metal with built-in value, that it could instead be a symbol backed entirely by institutional trust and government authority, took root during the Civil War and never let go. Step back and look at the whole arc, from clamshell beads and tobacco leaves to the bill folded in your wallet right now, and what you're really watching is a centuries-long experiment in trust. Every form of money the colonies and the young republic tried was, at its core, a bet on trust. Trust that tobacco would hold its value. Trust that wampum beads were genuine. Trust that a Spanish silver coin actually contained the weight it claimed. Trust that the bank down the street truly had gold locked in its vault. Trust that Congress would honor its promises. And the story of American currency, right up until 1862, is largely the story of that trust being built, shattered, and rebuilt again, an exhausting cycle that cost ordinary people their savings, their livelihoods, and in some cases far more. The Continental dollar collapsed because the trust behind it was never backed by real institutional power to tax and enforce. The wildcat banknotes failed because the trust behind them was nothing more than the word of men who were frequently liars. The greenback survived, flawed as it was, because by 1862 the country had finally built institutions strong enough to make its promises believable. And here's the part worth sitting with. The dollar in your pocket or on your banking app today is a direct descendant of those wartime greenbacks. It hasn't been backed by gold since 1971, when Richard Nixon severed the last formal link between the dollar and precious metal. Your money is backed by exactly the same thing that backed those first greenbacks in 1862. A promise, the full faith and credit of the United States government. Whether that promise is stronger or weaker today than it was during the Civil War is a question economists and ordinary citizens are still arguing over, as government debt climbs, as inflation swings, and as new digital forms of money challenge what currency even means anymore. But the history itself is unambiguous. America didn't casually stumble into paper money. It resisted it, feared it, tried it, watched it fail catastrophically, tried again, failed again, and only fully embraced it when the alternative was the collapse of the nation itself. Every single dollar bill is a quiet monument to that long, difficult struggle, even if nobody thinks about it while ordering their coffee.